During the days of the SONY Playstation, in a time where the late 90s were dominated by KoRn ruling the airwaves and video games were seen as tools of the devil, it was quite obvious that somebody needed to fight the demonic threat. You'd think so, but no. Instead we have one Bruce Yippee Ki-Yay Motherfucker Willis here to save the day, kick ass, and protect the world from the demonic threat in the 1998 video game Apocalypse.
Yeah, surprisingly not a lot of coverage on this game, which to me is actually pretty surprising when you consider that this game is probably one of the oldest examples of Hollywood actors breaking into the video game market.
Which should probably come as no shock to anybody, considering the fact that video games back in the 90s were usually seen as nothing more than stuff for kids or for teens, which the only real involvement you ever really got with Hollywood stars like Ellen Page or Gary Oldman, for example, were usually being there for fronting up games like Beyond Two Souls or Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, which to me does seem a little bit odd, especially considering the fact that it's taken them this long to start using their star power for marketing value. Now, while I don't exactly condone the usage of Hollywood actors as a means of enticing you to buy a video game, since I think that can purely be judged on the basis of whether or not the gameplay, aesthetics, and story offer up an experience that appeals to the player themselves to deem worthy of their time. But that's a rant for another day. The story of Apocalypse's development history is quite an interesting one. Beginning development in an in-house Activision development studio back in the days when Activision didn't suck, Apocalypse showcased a cyberpunk world where the player was being sent to prison while the main villain, known as the Reverend, was summoning his four horsemen of the apocalypse to rain terror across the world. Luckily for the player, however, Trey Kincaid, a brilliant scientist played by Bruce Willis, just so happened to be in the neighborhood to bust you out of prison, and from there it was up to you and Trey to put an end to the Reverend's retribution. The interesting thing about this version of the game is that compared to the final version that we see today, unlike the other game, this would capitalize on its star power and have you play as Bruce Willis's character, rather than just some random prisoner. Meanwhile, in the original version, Bruce Willis would be there as an AI partner, there to help you out and spout some one-liners. Story-wise, I'm not exactly sure how much of this game would have changed with the inclusion of the player's prisoner character, but as I'll bring up a little bit later, I think this might have been to the final game's detriment more than it was to its benefit. What ultimately shot the Activision version of the game in the arse, however, is the development problems they suffered while making the game. And while I can't exactly say specifically what the issue was, general rousing at the time was how the PS1 couldn't handle a lot of what Activision wanted to put into the game, which is pretty noticeable when you consider the chugging frame rate of the gameplay footage seen in the Activision beta. What happened as a result of this was developers clashing heads, leading to most of the internal developers being let go, with Activision being put in a dilemma. While the in-house team was gone, Activision still wanted to get their money's worth, considering that the kind of cash they flashed to get Bruce Willis signed on to the project most likely wasn't cheap. Ultimately, Activision handed over development to Neversoft, who, over the course of the 9-month development span, had to rework the game entirely and get it ready for release in 1998. In the end, the changes came in the form of Trey being the main character instead of the prisoner, with his lines being significantly shortened to only include brief cutscenes and one-liners. On a more positive note, however, the one thing Apocalypse did have to its advantage was its game engine that Neversoft used to broadcast live music videos in-game, with several bands and artists such as System of a Down, Snot, Poe, and Gearwhore. And so on October 31st, 1998, the Apocalypse had come, and so too did its eventual fade into obscurity, as most people barely even know about this game anymore.
But since this is a PS1 game from the late 90s, which just so happens to feature Bruce Willis, it's right up my alley. So what say you, my friend? Let's survive the apocalypse together and see how things panned out.
Our plot kicks off with a narration by our main villain, known as the Reverend. The Reverend is an evangelical scientist who, once having embraced science as his fundamental drive, abandoned such concepts and instead followed religion as his new devotion, and he set out to create the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Creating his unstoppable henchmen of war, beast, death, and pestilence, the Reverend is seemingly unopposed in his goal of enacting Judgment Day upon the world with only one man who stands in his way. Enter Trey Kincaid, a student of the Reverend and a former colleague of his who is now privy to the knowledge of how to stop the Reverend's four horsemen of the apocalypse, but unfortunately for him, he is now being sent to jail. And so the story ends with Trey spending the rest of his days in prison while the Reverend destroys the world.
Why you looking the other way? Why you had your eyes closed? Why you were licking your lips? 'Cause I was miserable.
No, of course it doesn't end there, but as you'd expect, Trey busts his way out of prison and escapes into the sewer system, where he then emerges
nice polygon.
Hey, if you think that's bad, you should have seen what happened after Trey left.
Just checking.
Making his way through the city, Trey returns to his old laboratory to find his assistant Larry still alive despite all the chaos.
I knew you'd come back for me, Trey. Larry, I thought you were dead. Oh yeah. God damn.
We don't want any.
With the reactor being struck during the fight, Trey dives out the window, summoning the power of his ancestor John McClane as he lands onto the adjacent rooftop where the police are hot on his trail. After losing the police force, Trey finds out from a news announcement that the Reverend is apparently dead.
Well, that was anticlimactic.
Okay, that didn't happen, but what Trey learns from this is that the Reverend's power extends to even the government. Which, while to some might criticize the story as being poorly developed, I don't exactly write off, even though there is a lot to the story that is rather bare bones. But at the very least, there is a semblance that this future is one that's a little bit more steeped in evangelical beliefs.
Well, praise the Lord and pass the ammunition.
Don't get it twisted. While the world building is anorexically thin, there is at least some evidence to suggest that the Reverend might have played a much bigger hand in manipulating events than one might initially think.
With Trey being hunted down on a citywide dragnet, he decides to lie low for a while and heads over to the nightclub where his ex-girlfriend Mary works, called Dead and Buried.
If you can guess what kind of enemies we face in this level, then I think the title speaks for itself.
Making his way inside, we see Mary performing in her band, looking like somebody who wouldn't look too out of place in a Devil May Cry game. But of course, considering that we fought tirelessly to get here, I think it's pretty obvious what's going to happen here.
My body becomes warm when I think of your flesh shredded
Oh,
and
baby,
devoured
not
by
you
my
too.
viruses. Oh, yeah, I missed you. Give Mommy a kiss before
After doing some pest control on Pestilence, Trey finds out that the weapons being used against him are being crafted in a factory, where they are assembling weaponry for the President of the United States. When the CEO of the factory makes a run for it, Trey sends the ship crashing down and prepares to do battle with war. With war out of commission, Trey sets his sights on the White House, where he comes to face the President of the United States to put an end to the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Making his way to the Oval Office, Trey discovers that the President is the final horseman of the Apocalypse and transforms into the devil-looking beast.
Why exactly the fourth horseman isn't called Famine, I have no idea.
After defeating Beast, Trey kills the Reverend, but not before he speaks his last about how he who battles demons will in and of himself become a demon, with the game ending about how Trey has implicitly turned into a demon.
Venom Snake, eat your heart out.
Overall, the story of Apocalypse is a weird one to say the least. On the one hand, it is entertaining with more than a few one-liners and comic moments such as this. And in addition to that, I think the world and character concepts are a pretty good basis to tell the story with, especially considering that the cyberpunk setting governed by religion and science can give some pretty decent story concepts, as well as having the Reverend oppose the player as somebody who devoutly believes in the apocalypse.
However, therein lies the problem.
But Apocalypse's biggest failing story-wise is that it does so little to capitalize on these concepts and flesh them out, leading to the game that, while to some people might have the potential for expansion, it's ultimately something that just does nothing with its premise. I mean, you've already gone out of your way to establish a lot of the basic groundwork for the story about how religion and science are being used to rule the apocalypse on Earth, and yet the game mostly just utilizes that as a means of hopping to level, rather than exploring what kind of effect that has on the world at large. I suppose in many ways I could cut Apocalypse some slack in this regard, since it was 1998, a time in which video game stories being fleshed out was a concept that was only ever relegated to RPGs, but even still, I find this kind of story a tad lacking as far as the story is concerned. And I suppose my final critique would be how haphazard the ending is. I mean, it feels like having Trey get possessed should be a massive "whoa dude, totally unradical man" kind of plot twist, but really, it leaves such a little impact on the viewer since this is just the end of it and we have absolutely no idea what's going to happen, or how it's going to shape the world as a result. Maybe this is something that would have expanded into the true final boss fight had the Activision version of the game survived, with you playing as the prisoner character and Trey being the final boss, but even in a general sense, that's sloppy closure.
And I honestly don't think I'd have a problem with this if... Whoa. Where am I? Uh-oh. And honestly, I don't think I'd have such a big problem with this if it just wasn't so abrupt, you know? I mean, it's like there was supposed to be something more to it, but it was suddenly cut short or altered to act as if that whatever had just happened had never existed. Look, anyway, the point in short that I'm trying to make is that the ending felt a little abrupt.
But don't get it twisted, I don't think Apocalypse's story is outright terrible, just one that I feel could have had a little bit more done with its world building to truly give an impact to the threat of annihilation by the Reverend. Onto the gameplay side of things, Trey controls surprisingly well compared to most third-person shooters on the PS1. The way in which the game functions is kind of like an arcade-styled shooter where you use the D-pad or analog stick to move around while the triangle, square, circle, and X buttons allow Trey to fire his gun in the corresponding direction. Combined with a crouch and dodge roll move, smart bombs, and Trey's ability to jump, the control scheme of Apocalypse is a relatively simple one, but it's a control scheme that I feel is very easy to pick up and play. In terms of guns, Trey starts out with a basic machine gun with infinite ammo, but unfortunately what does have an ammo count in this game are the additional weapons such as the particle beam, flamethrower, rocket launcher, homing missiles, grenade launcher, rip laser, and the pulse laser. In the case of the particle beam, flamethrower, and rip laser, these weapons are meant to be used as a beam weapon used to cut through goons like a knife through warm butter, which I do recommend for clearing out small fry like soldiers and zombies. As for the pulse laser, that's basically a more powerful extension of your machine gun, which can be very useful if you've got no other weapon to fall back on, and it still packs a mega punch in its own right. And finally, as you could probably guess, the rocket launcher, homing missiles, and grenade launcher are your explosive type weapons, which should be more or less safe for bosses or large enemies such as tanks. In terms of mission structure, the game is based on a level by level sequence, which of course follows the events based in the story, but the very linear experience I feel is best suited to this kind of arcadey styled action game. Bosses on the other hand might be a little bit too samey to some people, but for me personally, I think their battles are pretty unique in smaller ways than one might think. That, and I do still find that Trey's girlfriend is probably one of the sexiest pieces of us I've ever seen in a video game. Though that might just be the loneliness of my existence finally kicking in.
Overall, the gameplay of Apocalypse is pretty self-explanatory with not really too much to talk about. But don't mistake this for me saying that the game is completely bare bones, because despite its simplicity, there is quite a lot of fun to be had with this game.
In fact, given how relatively simple the gameplay style is for one of these kinds of games, like Doom or Jackie Chan's Stuntmaster, it's the kind of game where you can just pick up and play and have generally a good time with it. Over to the technical aspects, graphically, while Apocalypse bears all the hallmarks of a PS1 game, while to some that might make the game look visually outdated to them, to me, it looks pretty decent by PS1 standards. However, one bit of visual fidelity that I do like about Apocalypse by comparison to other games, and it's a technique that I've only ever seen in Forbidden Siren for the PlayStation 2, is the use of photo mapping for Bruce Willis's face on Trey Kincaid's character model. It's a very small detail, but it's one you can notice if you ever get a good look at Willis's face during certain shots during the gameplay sequence. Another positive to Apocalypse's favour, as I mentioned earlier, is the ability to project live-action music video clips into the game itself. Although, while we're on the subject, I do find it both strange yet actually pretty fucking gnarly to know that at some point in the future we're gonna have large billboards which play System of a Down at varied times of the day.
Look at the light! Come in your fight! With all your prayers and incantations running away! A trickle day of judgment and deliverance!
Speaking of music, the soundtrack of the game, as I've already showcased, contains a variety of licensed artists within the rock and industrial genres. However, the main soundtrack, composed by Tommy Taraco, perfectly manages to capture the balance between techno and rock, which perfectly fits Apocalypse's visuals and tone, with my favourite track of the game being for the boss War. If there is one criticism that I do have about the sound design of the game, it would be that the audio during the cutscenes feels a bit unpolished. Granted, I can give Apocalypse a little bit of leeway since it was 1998 and video games were still getting used to the whole idea of packing a story in with cutscenes and all that. However, the one problem that does stem from it is that sometimes the dialogue during cutscenes is a tad unintelligible. Although that's really more of a minor thing in the grand scheme of things in the entire game.
So with all that said, what are my final thoughts on Apocalypse?
Overall, Apocalypse is the kind of game that I kind of view on the same wavelength as games like The Matrix Path of Neo, Jackie Chan's Stuntmaster, or even Doom. It's the kind of game that I can just kick back and play on a Friday night after a stressful day where it's just you, the TV, a PlayStation, a nice big bottle of Pepsi, and the rockin' sounds of System of a Down. While its story does leave a little bit more to be desired, and its cutscene audio might be a tad choppy at times, on the whole, Apocalypse is the kind of game that is well worth your time if you're looking for a game you can chill out with. In terms of recommendations, if you like Bruce Willis, a futuristic cyberpunk setting with evangelistic undertones, all wrapped up in a combination of some fantastic gameplay and industrial metal music, then I think Apocalypse will be your salvation should you find yourself needing to unwind after a stressful day.
So on that note, I'm Skully, keep it new metal, and if you'll excuse me, looks like I've got my own apocalypse to deal with. Catch you later. Trust in me, like to be. I'm something to something, something. Babadoo bop, ba-da-ba-babadoo bob. What the bop, bop-a-doo what? What the fuck?